For decades, Paul McCartney has lived with something almost every superstar eventually faces: rumors that refuse to disappear. Some were about his relationships, some about the Beatles, and others grew from stories fans repeated for generations. But at 82, McCartney began addressing parts of his past and present with a level of openness that caught attention. Were the stories people had whispered about for years actually true? And what did Paul himself finally say when the questions became impossible to ignore? For more than 6 decades, Paul McCartney has lived under a level of public attention that few musicians have ever experienced. From the moment the Beatles became a worldwide phenomenon, almost every part of his life became something fans wanted to understand. His music was discussed. His relationships were discussed. His friendships were discussed. Even small comments could become the beginning of a much bigger story. And once a rumor entered Beatles history, it could survive for decades. Some stories began with a real event but became exaggerated as they were repeated. Others came from misunderstandings, newspaper reports, fan theories, or comments taken completely out of context. One of the most famous examples is the enormous mythology surrounding the Beatles themselves. By the late 1960s, the band had become so famous that fans were searching for hidden meanings everywhere. Songs were examined for secret messages. Album artwork was studied for clues. Ordinary photographs suddenly seemed suspicious. Then came one of the biggest rumors in music history: the claim that Paul McCartney had secretly died and been replaced by a look-alike. The theory became known as the Paul is dead conspiracy. It suggested that McCartney had died in a car accident and that the Beatles had secretly replaced him with another person. Supporters claimed there were hidden clues in lyrics, album covers, and recordings. The story was completely false, but it became so widespread that it entered popular culture permanently. McCartney eventually addressed the bizarre theory through humor and public comments, but by then, the rumor had already taken on a life of its own. And that tells us something important about Paul McCartney's relationship with rumors. Once millions of people become emotionally invested in a story, simply denying it does not always make it disappear. The same pattern appeared with stories about his relationships, his family life, his creative decisions, and his time with the Beatles. Some questions were reasonable. Others became increasingly strange. But there was always one thing that made the rumors powerful. Paul rarely gave the public every detail of his private life. That silence created space for people to fill in the blanks. And as the years passed, fans began asking a bigger question. After everything Paul McCartney had experienced, from Beatlemania and the breakup of the world's biggest band to personal loss, and decades of life in the spotlight, what did he actually think about the stories people have been telling about him? Because eventually, some of those rumors were not just about the past. They were about the man Paul McCartney had become. And as he entered his 80s, some of his most revealing comments began giving fans a very different perspective on the stories they thought they already knew. But what did Paul actually confirm? And what was nothing more than a rumor? As Paul McCartney grew older, something interesting happened. The public became just as interested in the man behind the music as they were in the music itself. For decades, Paul had been surrounded by questions about love, family, friendship, loss, and the private decisions that shaped his life. But unlike many modern celebrities, he rarely felt the need to explain every detail. That silence often created more curiosity. One of the biggest subjects was his relationship with Linda McCartney. Their marriage became one of the most important relationships in Paul's life, but it was also watched closely by the public. They spent years together, raised a family, and built a life that existed partly away from the intense world of the Beatles. When Linda died from breast cancer in 1998, Paul's life changed dramatically. Yet even after such a devastating loss, the public continued to speculate about what happened behind closed doors. Paul's later relationships became part of that conversation too. He eventually married Heather Mills in 2002, but the marriage ended in a highly publicized divorce. The legal battle attracted enormous media attention, and once again, Paul's private life became a public story. Later, he married Nancy Shevell in 2011. That relationship was notably different. There was less of the explosive media drama that had surrounded his previous marriage, and Paul appeared increasingly comfortable keeping his personal life away from constant public discussion. This is important because many rumors surrounding Paul were built on assumptions about what people thought his private life should look like. But Paul himself has often presented a much simpler picture. He has spoken about the importance of family, memories, music, and the people he has lost. And as he entered his 80s, he became increasingly reflective about his past. At that stage of life, the questions were no longer simply about fame. They were about memory. What did he remember about the Beatles? What did he regret? What did he wish he had done differently? And what stories about his life had been misunderstood? Paul's answers did not always provide the dramatic confirmation that sensational headlines promised. Sometimes, the truth was much more ordinary. And that is one of the biggest lessons when looking at celebrity rumors. The real story can be less shocking than the rumor, but far more interesting. Paul McCartney's life was already extraordinary without inventing anything. He became one of the most successful musicians in history, experienced the rise and collapse of the Beatles, endured profound personal loss, rebuilt his career, raised a family, and continued performing well into his later years. There was no need for a secret explanation. Yet one category of rumors remained especially fascinating: the stories connected to the Beatles. Because when it comes to Paul McCartney, the past never really stays in the past. And some of the most persistent stories were not about his relationships at all. They were about what really happened inside the world's most famous band. And that is where the rumors become even more complicated. If there is one thing Paul McCartney has never been able to escape, it is the Beatles. Even decades after the group ended, fans continued searching through old interviews, photographs, songs, and memory for answers about what really happened inside the band. And some of those stories became far bigger than the facts behind them. One of the most famous was the idea that Paul and John Lennon were secretly enemies during the final years of the Beatles. There was certainly tension. The band was under enormous pressure. Creative disagreements were becoming more serious, and each member had different ideas about what should happen next. But turning that tension into a simple story of two musicians who hated each other misses a much more complicated reality. Paul and John had been friends long before they became global stars. They created songs together, challenged each other creatively, and built one of the most successful partnerships in music history. Their disagreements did not erase that history. In fact, after the Beatles ended, their relationship continued in unexpected ways. They sometimes criticized each other's work publicly, but they also remained connected. That complicated relationship became the subject of endless speculation. Then there was the breakup itself. For years, fans wanted a single person to blame. Some blamed Paul, others blamed John. Some blamed Yoko Ono, others pointed to business problems, exhaustion, drugs, changing musical interests, or simply the fact that four young men had grown into four adults who no longer wanted the same thing. The reality was much more complicated. The Beatles did not fall apart because of one single event. Their breakup was the result of many pressures building over time. Yet simple explanations are easier to remember than complicated ones. That is why rumors survived. The same thing happened with the famous "Paul is dead" theory. Fans examined album covers and lyrics, believing hidden clues had been deliberately planted by the Beatles. The cover of Abbey Road became especially famous because of the way the four members were dressed and positioned. Paul was barefoot. He was carrying a cigarette. And because of the strange interpretation fans gave the image, ordinary details were transformed into supposed evidence. The theory became so enormous that journalists asked Paul about it directly. Instead of treating it like a serious mystery, McCartney often responded with humor. And perhaps that was the best possible response. Because the more seriously people treated the theory, the more ridiculous it became. But there were other Beatles rumors that were more difficult to dismiss. Questions about who wrote which songs, arguments over songwriting credits, disagreements about money, and the complicated relationships between the four members after the breakup. These stories matter because they involved real people, real disagreements, and real emotions. The problem was that decades of retelling often turned complicated events into simple headlines. Paul's own reflections later in life offered a more nuanced picture. He could remember the arguments while still remembering the friendship. He could discuss painful moments without pretending the good years never happened. And that may be the most interesting thing about McCartney's story. The truth was rarely as simple as the rumors. But there was still one question fans kept returning to. After all these years, which stories about Paul McCartney were actually true, and which ones had become myths. The problem with the Paul McCartney rumor is that some of them begin with a tiny piece of truth. Then someone adds an assumption. Someone else repeats it. A newspaper gives it a dramatic headline. And decades later, the rumor can sound like established history. Paul himself has spoken about this problem before. In discussing the Beatles' breakup, he pushed back against the idea that he was simply the person responsible for ending the band. He explained that the breakup was much more complicated, and that decisions were made collectively. Even though he often ended up being the person who voiced them, that distinction matters. Because one of the most repeated stories about the Beatles is that Paul somehow became the band's boss and pushed everyone else around. But McCartney later reflected on Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary and admitted that he had worried about how he might appear. He expected viewers might see him as overly controlling. Instead, watching the footage gave him a different perspective. He felt the film showed him making suggestions and trying to organize ideas rather than constantly ordering the others around. That is a very different picture from the simplified version of the story. And then there's another rumor that has returned again and again. Could the Beatles ever reunite? For decades, whenever Paul or another surviving Beatle made even a slightly positive comment about playing together, headlines would appear suggesting a reunion was coming. McCartney has explained why those rumors never seem to disappear. At different times, one of the Beatles might say they would not mind playing together, and that alone could restart the entire rumor cycle. But Paul also said he did not believe a full Beatles reunion would actually happen. Then something extraordinary happened in 2024. Paul and Ringo's Starr were still making music and performing, while John Lennon and George Harrison remained present through their recordings and legacy. McCartney's attitude toward the Beatles' past also seemed to change with time. In a 2024 interview, he explained that once he was far enough removed from the band, he could listen to John's and George's music almost like a fan. He said his appreciation for everything the Beatles created had grown, because he could finally look at it from a distance. That may be one of the most important clues to understanding the rumors. Time changes perspective. A man who once lived inside the chaos of Beatlemania could eventually look back and see the entire story differently. And perhaps the biggest surprise is that there was no single secret explanation waiting to be revealed. The Beatles story was complicated because the people inside it were complicated. They loved each other. They argued. They created incredible music. They became exhausted. They went their separate ways. And yet, decades later, the connection remained. In 2024, that connection was visible again when Ringo Starr joined McCartney on stage during his Got Back tour in London. The two former Beatles performed together, giving fans a rare reminder that the band's story was never completely frozen in 1970. But if Paul had learned to look back at the Beatles with greater appreciation, what happened when he looked at his own life? At 82, McCartney was not simply answering old questions. He was reflecting on what mattered most after a lifetime of fame, and his answer was surprisingly personal. By the time Paul McCartney reached 82, the story was no longer about whether he could still remain famous. That question had already been answered decades earlier. The more interesting question was whether he still wanted to keep going, and the answer was remarkably clear. McCartney continued touring, performing, recording, and speaking about music with the same enthusiasm that had defined much of his life. In 2024, at 82, he was still performing long concerts and moving between songs from the Beatles, Wings, and his solo career. His Got Back tour even brought him back to London for major performances late that year. That alone challenged one of the quiet assumptions surrounding aging celebrities. Many people expected that, eventually, Paul would simply step away. But McCartney did not seem interested in disappearing. In fact, reports from 2024 quoted him pushing back against the idea that he was ready for retirement. And that matters because so many rumors about celebrities are built around the idea that something must be changing behind the scenes. If a star slows down, people speculate. If they keep working, people speculate. If they disappear for a while, people speculate even more. Paul's approach was different. He kept doing what he had always done. He made music. He performed. He talked about the past. And he continued looking forward. There was also something revealing about the way he talked about his history. Instead of treating the Beatles as a chapter that needed to be forgotten, McCartney increasingly seemed comfortable looking back at it. The distance of time had changed the way he viewed those years. He could remember the arguments and still appreciate the friendships. He could discuss the breakup without pretending it had been simple. And he could revisit old recordings without being trapped by the emotions of the 1960s. That perspective became especially visible around Beatles 64, the documentary that revisited the group's first American trip. In new interviews, McCartney reflected on experiences from more than 6 decades earlier, showing how differently a man in his 80s could remember the same events he had lived through as a young musician. And perhaps that is the biggest change. The rumors were still there. The old questions were still there. But Paul was no longer the young Beatle who had to answer every criticism immediately. He had lived long enough to see which stories survived and which ones disappeared. He had also lived long enough to understand that some things did not need to be defended forever. At 82, McCartney's continued energy became part of the story itself. His performances showed that the desire to create had not disappeared simply because the years had passed. And that brings us to the final question. After decades of rumors, theories, arguments, and speculation, what did Paul McCartney actually leave fans with? Was there really one huge secret he had finally confirmed? Or was the real revelation something much simpler? Because sometimes the most surprising truth about a legendary celebrity is not the rumor itself. It is what remains after the rumor finally stops mattering. After decades of rumors, there was never going to be one magical sentence that suddenly explained everything about Paul McCartney. The truth was much more interesting. At 82, Paul was still standing on stage, performing for enormous audiences and revisiting songs that had been part of his life for more than half a century. During the final London shows of his 2024 Got Back tour, he performed a 36-song set lasting around 2 hours and 40 minutes. That alone said something powerful. The man surrounded by rumors was still writing his own story. For years, people had speculated about whether Paul would retire, whether the Beatles could reunite, whether old conflicts still bothered him, and whether the stories surrounding his past were really accurate. But his actions told a different story. He kept performing, he kept creating, and he kept looking back at the Beatles without allowing the old rumors to define him. One of the clearest examples came through his reflections on the band. Instead of simply defending his version of history, Paul increasingly seemed able to appreciate the past from a distance. In a 2024 interview, he discussed the Beatles, John Lennon, and the way audiences still react emotionally when songs such as Hey Jude are played. That perspective is important, because when you are young, an argument can feel like the end of the world. But when you are 82, you have had decades to understand what really mattered. Paul had lost John. He had lost George. He had lost Linda. He had watched generations grow up with Beatles music. And somehow, through all of it, the music remained. Even the old Paul is Dead conspiracy, one of the strangest rumors in music history, had ultimately become something people remembered as pop culture mythology rather than reality. The rumor was publicly denied during Paul's lifetime, and McCartney himself addressed it decades ago. So what did Paul finally confirm? Perhaps the biggest answer is that there was never one giant secret waiting to destroy the story. There were complicated relationships. There were disagreements. There were painful moments. There were decisions Paul wished had gone differently. And there were countless stories that became exaggerated as they passed from one generation to another. But there was also something much simpler. Paul McCartney really did survive the impossible pressure of Beatlemania. He really did help create some of the most influential music ever recorded. He really did lose people he loved. And he really did continue moving forward. At 82, that may have been the most important revelation of all. The rumors were still interesting. The theories were still entertaining. But they were no longer the center of his story. The center was the music, the memories, the people he loved. An extraordinary fact that after more than 60 years in the spotlight, Paul McCartney was still not finished. So perhaps the real lesson behind all those rumors is this.